Well, everyone, I can't believe the summer has come to an end for another summer of drawing. Hopefully, we'll have other opportunities to get together for different types of classes, but it's time for me to let you free to fly off and do drawings and such. But I wanted to start off with a couple of things. First off, well, to begin with, one of the one of the artists had the really great idea earlier on that we should introduce ourselves to each other. So I thought that the best way to do that, because there are so many of us, in the class today, is just to go ahead and type in chat, who you are, where you're from. Um, any other information you might want to include, whether you've got a Martha's Vineyard connection or not. And then for people who are watching the video later on, I'd be happy to hear from you, where you're watching from and how you came upon the class, just out of curiosity, because we've become kind of our own little art community over time. And I'm going to talk more about that later on. But the other thing I want to do is I want to thank all of you guys, because thanks to you, I've become much better at drawing over the last couple of summers. I now have my tools and my drawing supplies, laid out on my drafting table. I'm actually drawing so often, I don't even remember to keep putting them all away. And I think that's really marvelous, because I'm sort of, that phrase, lower the barrier to entry. I've lowered it for myself by constantly having my drawing supplies at the ready. Makes it a lot easier to get into a project. So I hope the same sort of thing is happening for you. So today, what we're going to be doing is we've got a nice restful scene. I haven't done a drawing, although I did a notan to get started. This is going to be all on you, whether you want to use white paper, tone paper, your favorite drawing instruments, whatever. I'm still going to do a bit of coaching, but I've got a lot to talk about in terms of just drawing and art in general while you're going through this. So let me go ahead and get started. Another summer of drawing, class number 19. I cannot believe that we have gone through 19 different ways to interpret home, and we could probably keep going. So bald cypress home is the topic for the week, which I'm sure has you guessing. So let's have a look and see what we're going to do. All right, so these are cypress trees in a cypress swamp. And I decided to include this in terms of the interpreting the concept of home, because the Great Dismal Swamp, and this is actually not the Great Dismal Swamp, this is another swamp kind of close to it. And I can, in the follow-up PDF, I'll send you a little information about where this is exactly. But in North Carolina, there are a number of different, and the southern part of Virginia, number of different sort of swampy areas very close to and sort of probably would have been originally connected with the Great Dismal Swamp. And that is an area, when I used to live in Virginia, I would love to go and visit, because it has this sort of, you think it's very still and lonely and that nothing is going on there, but it's actually home to a great number of creatures. And you can see that I've listed here, 47 species of mammals, 27 species of fish. It goes on and on, 209 bird species. It's also on a migratory path, so it has lots of birds coming through. And so I think it's wonderful to look at a scene like this and think, we might go, hey, I could not myself build a house right here, although communities did live within the Great Dismal Swamp. And the history of it is just fascinating. I could get into that, but I won't at this particular time. But it's also a beautiful, peaceful scene to draw that comes with its own challenges, as per usual. So, observation, how to interpret this scene. It would be my inclination, if you came across a scene like this, to choose only a very small portion to draw. For example, we've got this sort of row of trees that are dark up front. Maybe pick 2 or 3 of those to be sort of the main part of your scene. And then, the distant swamp and trees behind that, concentrating mostly on the fact that as things disappear into the background, they become lighter, less distinct, more fuzzy. And so we've got an opportunity here to vary the pencil type and the stroke direction, use blending and maybe some of those harder leads to render the distant background so that it does not compete with the foreground. But if you try to draw all of these trees, it would probably get a little confusing. And in this case, whether you're working on white or toned paper, you want the paper to do a little bit of work. So if you're working on toned paper, probably that second layer of trees in particular can just be the paper color, and some of the foliage and other things like that. If you're working on white paper, you've got all of this white reflection and such, which doesn't need to have any pencil mark on it. So how you go about deciding where to draw and what to draw has a lot to do with the paper color that you're dealing with. The idea is to do the least amount of drawing possible and to have the number of branches and trees and such symbolize the greater scene without having to have every little thing detailed. So when it comes to composition, of course, going back to those original classes, don't forget to use a viewfinder as much as possible, or even just a mental viewfinder. And what I did here was I just sort of isolated a few different possibilities of scenes. You could do, anything at all. You don't have to make it as wide as I did. You could pick only 2 trees. And when you do that, and you start to do a no-tan, which is what we'll do next, you'll start to immediately encounter some questions. So one of those questions will be, what has to be light, what has to be dark, how many trees have to go in there. But mostly this business about what do I do about things that are less distinct, that may not really serve the purpose. So the story today, so to speak, that we're dealing with is the atmospheric and seemingly quiet swamp scene. The bald cypress trees, the water, the reflections, and that kind of thing. And the question really to ask ourselves is, well, how much stuff has to be in a drawing in order for us to get that across to ourselves? We don't actually have to render every single one of the trees that we see in the photograph. So let's go ahead and start with a no-tan. Figure out where you're drawing, like what you're going to draw, and start to look at the patterns of light and dark. You know that squinting always works to help with that, or at least, lowering your lashes to the point that you can really see the dark and the light shapes. And then don't include details in your no-tan if you can. This is just about the design, the overall design. When you do a no-tan, you can remove extra objects and move things around. And what you're looking for is to figure out if your composition has good balance. So sometimes it can be helpful to add in another value, making it a 2 or 3 color no-tan, which is called a value study. And I'm just going to show you really quickly while you're doing your no-tan, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So what I did was I saw very quickly that as I did my no-tan, which was the one on the top, and I added in a second value, a lighter gray, because I felt like I needed to organize my design better. I could see, even as I was halfway into it, that if I added the trees over on the left and the right, whether the foreground or background, it was all going to get really busy. I had too much stuff going on. So I decided to zoom in and make the second layer of trees, the ones next far back, an even lighter value than they actually appear in real life, so that there was real definition between what's foreground, what's background. I also zoomed in, so I cut out the busy stuff that was on the side that was going to cause me trouble. And I also decided to make it more obvious that the reflections were shorter than the trees themselves. You could do it the other way around too, just because I thought that made a better scene. So I'm going to flip back to where you can see the notes about just what to look for. So, the no-tan is the perfect time to start deciding how you're going to eliminate things. Because I decided to eliminate most of the trees that I saw, in terms of the overall design, it meant that when I got to a drawing, I could add a few things back in again. I don't have to leave it that sparse, but I understood what was actually going to anchor everything. So while you're doing your no-tan, I'm just going to quickly look at chat. Oh my goodness, we've got people from all over. That is absolutely amazing. Oh, how fantastic. If you folks aren't sure exactly how to use chat, if anybody hasn't done that, all you have to do is click on the little chat icon and there'll be a place for you to type in. And so, and I also should mention, I'm going to stay on, because this is our last class, I'm going to stay online a little bit longer to answer any questions if anybody has any, but you can always feel free to email me. I'm heading off on a holiday for a little bit, which will be a nice break. So if you don't hear back from me right away, I'm not ignoring your email, but I will answer as soon as I get back. But I think, it's really great for us to continue the conversations that we've started. I'm always a resource for you. I'm always ready to answer your questions. And so I'm going to get us right into our drawing as quickly as possible today. So just give yourself a little more time. If you've decided to change your scene halfway through, which, tends to happen, and you really actually want to pick different trees to draw, you still have a couple of minutes to do that. And I'm going to figure out where I put my coffee because that is an essential ingredient this morning. You would think by the time I got to 19 classes, I'd have it all like turnkey. But what happens is I keep filling in the quote unquote extra time with more stuff. So I've got a pile of books and all sorts of things to read today. And hopefully while you're sketching and drawing, I can impart something that's actually useful. So I was just saying that Notan is a perfect place to make those design decisions, to make sure your design is as strong as possible. And this is what we're going to look at today to draw. I'm just going to leave it here until we get near the end of the class, so that you can just draw and do your own thing. Now, I think this is really useful because often when we've drawn from a complicated picture, I've already cropped it down and you're seeing it a little smaller often, which makes it a little bit easier to eliminate the detail. This is much more like seeing something in real life, seeing all of it in front of you, and it's overwhelming. So trying to make some of those decisions really just comes down to not having to put everything in there. When I tell people all the time when I go to paint portraits and they might be a little bit worried about their appearance, and I tell them, it's extra work to put in all the wrinkles and everything. So, I talk about oil paint being the ultimate Photoshop, but really, art gives us that control. We don't have to, it's not that we have to actually repeat everything that we see in front of us. It's about what we think is interesting. How much do we actually need, to show how a scene works? We don't necessarily need to see everything. And I think that's really important. Okay, so while you're doing that, I've got some stuff to read. And let me figure out exactly where those things are. Now, while I'm busy paging through this book, because it would have been really useful if I'd bookmarked it, but I didn't, I did want to point out some interesting stuff that I saw when I was looking at that photograph in the first place. And one of the things was the stuff that I think gets confusing to us are things like, the green foliage that's just coming out. This is probably a very early springtime scene. And then we've got this green kind of algae that's floating, on top of the water. And in pencil, what do you do with that? And this is where you have to do that business that I had spoken about before, where sometimes you have to make a decision to either shove something that you see into the light area or the dark area to kind of help you control what's going on. So if I were drawing this, it would be my inclination probably to take my eraser at some point for the algae and just pick out the lines that are formed by the algae, not worry so much about the color, is it green or not? Because what I like about the algae is that it interrupts the dark areas or even the mid-tone areas of that second reflection back. And so that's one sort of solution. When it comes to the foliage, for example, I would probably push it a little bit darker. You can see over on the far right tree that's in the foreground how the shoots and suckers that come out from the bottom of the tree are a bit on the darker side, and that sort of adds to the design. So it might be that, even for the foreground tree where we see the leaves that are a little bit brighter green, maybe giving them some of that same treatment so that it's not just sort of sticks going up, but you actually have a little bit more than just branches to show the form of the foliage going across. And that's the sort of decision making that, gosh, only you can do. Only you can decide for what you see, what you think would be the best way to approach it. Checking chat. If you guys have any, thanks so much for these wonderful messages. If you have any specific questions, I'm not ignoring them. I'll either look later or look at the end. And if for some reason I bypass them completely, I'll add them in the email I send around afterwards with the PDF. So be assured, I will definitely answer any questions that come up. So early on in the drawing series, I read a poem by the poet Mary Oliver. And so I thought I would read one or maybe even two, if I can find the other one, poems right now that I think have a lot to do with the idea of just getting out there and experiencing life. I like her poetry a lot because it's sort of, I think a lot of it was written in the area that we live in, the Cape and Islands, this area of New England. So, I like it from that point of view. But I also like her ability to sort of prioritize nature and her interactions with it over some of the other things that we worry about in the day to day. And so, even though some of her poetry is a little sad, or she talks about some of the inevitabilities of life and death in the natural world. These poems are not about that. These are more on theme of the kind of thing that I try to get you to do, which is just go out and experience life and nature. But in my case, I want you to do it taking your sketchbook along. So I'm going to read this particular poem, which is called, "Have You Ever Tried to Enter the Long Black Branches?" Have you ever tried to enter the long black branches of other lives? Tried to imagine what the crisp fringes full of honey hanging from the branches of the young locust trees in early summer feel like? Do you think this world is only an entertainment for you? Never to enter the sea and notice how the water divides with perfect courtesy to let you in? Never to lie down on the grass as though you were the grass? Never to leap up to the air as you open your wings over the dark acorn of your heart? No wonder we hear in your mournful voice the complaint that something is missing from your life. Who can open the door who does not reach for the latch? Who can travel the miles who does not put one foot in front of the other, all attentive to what presents itself continually? Who will behold the inner chamber who has not observed with admiration, even rapture, the outer stone? Well, there is time left. Fields everywhere invite you into them. And who will care? Who will chide you if you wander away from wherever you are to look for your soul? Quickly then, get up, put on your coat, leave your desk. To put one's foot into the door of the grass, which is the mystery, which is death as well as life, and be not afraid. To set one's foot in the door of death and be overcome with amazement. To sit down in front of the weeds and imagine God the ten-fingered sailing out of his house of straw, nodding this way and that to the flowers of the present hour, to the song falling out of the mockingbird's pink mouth, to the tiplets of the honeysuckle that have opened in the night, to sit down like a weed amongst weeds and rustle in the wind. Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? While the soul, after all, is only a window, and the opening of the window no more difficult than the wakening from a little sleep. Only last week I went out among the thorns and said to the wild roses, "Deny me not, but suffer my devotion." Then all afternoon I sat among them. Maybe I even heard a curl or two of music, damp and rouge red, hurrying from their stubby buds, from their delicate watery bodies. For how long will you continue to listen to those dark shouters, caution and prudence? Fall in, fall in. A woman standing in the weeds, a small boat flounders in the deep waves, and what's coming next is coming with its own heave and grace. Meanwhile, once in a while, I have chanced amongst the quick things upon the immutable. What more could one ask? And I would touch the faces of the daisies, and I would bow down to think about it. That was then, which hasn't ended yet. Now the sun begins to swing down. Under the peach light, I cross the fields and the dunes. I follow the ocean's edge. I climb, I backtrack, I float. I ramble my way home. So you can sort of see why I like Mary Oliver's poetry, considering, sort of the approach I like to take to drawing as well. So to get back to the drawing technique for just a second here, what to do about that distant foreground is really a problem with a lot of folks, because once you get in and start drawing, you start to see more than you saw initially. And one of the things that you see are those distant trees. And so, if you're not purposefully reaching for a 4H or a 2H or definitely an H pencil to do those, you're probably going to end up drawing them really a little bit darker than they need to be, particularly if you've already lightened the value of the midground trees to differentiate them from the foreground trees. So one thing you can do to sort of get yourself around that is, of course, to darken up what's going on in the foreground. There's always an adjustment that's made. One of the things that you'll hear a lot of painters say when they come back to their painting, and I think it's true for drawing as well, is that when you come back and you sit down again, it's time to restate the darks. In other words, those darks are probably not as dark as they felt before you started working on all that midtone stuff. Now you might need to, pump them up a little bit, just in certain places, not overall, but for example, down where the bottom of the trunk meets the water, and then underneath where the branches are, because of course the branches and some of that foliage cast a little bit of shading down. So the trunk is not just evenly colored all the way up and down. There's some light and darks. But when you get to that distant stuff way back there, a couple of little things are useful. One of them is using your blending tool or maybe even your finger just to make whatever's back there a little less distinct. And then maybe do just a little bit of the same type of treatment in the midground and none of that in the foreground, because our eyes are drawn, as we know, to contrast, to detail and sharpness. And this will allow us to get that feeling of the distance. One thing that's kind of interesting about this particular photograph as well is because it's a very misty, atmospheric kind of day. And of course, we want to repeat that same behavior in the water because, as you see, there's a tiny, tiny little bit of ripple. So everything is a little less distinct. The reflections are not as sharp in this case as the actual things above the water. But you will notice when you go around from, hopefully from this day on, that sometimes reflections in the water are darker than the object themselves. It's not a rule of thumb. It has a lot to do with what the light from the sky is doing, and what kind of bottom there is to the water area and all of that sort of thing. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you've got a glare coming from some direction that makes the reflections lighter. But it's one of those things to observe. It helps you a little bit to differentiate above the water and below the water. So in this particular case, you can see just a slight kind of fuzz that happens, regardless of whether it's in the background or foreground. And that'll help you, kind of change how this looks. I think one of the more difficult aspects of this particular scene is definitely to well, not only are you dealing with this idea of atmosphere, but you don't have any sort of horizon line that you can really key in on. What you've got are all these little horizon lines of the bottom. They're not really horizon lines, but it sort of feels like that, sort of staged back and forth areas of the of the bases of the trees, and those sort of have to work. If you find some of those are going lopsided, they're going to make it look like the water has divots in it. So just kind of keep that stuff relatively straight. Someone's asked about a foliage technique. What I would definitely be doing is I would be using a pencil that had a beveled tip to it, if you have one around. And if you don't, I would be using a kind of either a blunt pencil or tip my pencil to the side so that large flatter areas were being used. Because once again, if you squint, you can see some of those branches, the tracery of the branches, but you really can't see the foliage itself. So I would be looking at the foliage on the lower right, on that foreground tree on the right, where we see those sprouts and everything come out, and the foliage there is a bit darker. I would be looking at that, kind of the indistinctness of it, and trying to emulate that for some of the higher branches, to the extent that you can or that you want to. Now, if you're working on toned paper, you could potentially leave some of that foliage, just the paper color, and try instead to use your pencil to show the dark branches, and then of course white charcoal to sort of work around that. That's a little tricky. But it definitely can be done. On white paper, you're usually going to have to figure out some value to sort of assign to the foliage. And I would be going for something that was a little bit darker than the trees in the midground, just so that you've definitely got this idea of foreground, midground, and background. I mean, in a sketch that you do for the very first time when you're encountering a subject, all of your decisions are not going to be right away. So it's just really a matter of kind of stabbing around a little bit, seeing what works. You might try something into another part of a drawing, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's what I needed to do with the foreground. So, be easy on yourself about that sort of thing. Okay, I'm giving up. I'm giving up on that. And I'm going to move to my next pile of, of notes. If I figure out what the other poem was I was looking for, I'll let you know. But I do hope that whether it's music or poetry or reading or whatever, I think all of us, we're trying to describe the world in different places. Oh, somebody's asked the name of the book. So this is actually a 2-volume set by Mary Oliver, of Mary Oliver's collected poems, and it's called New and Selected Poems, Volume 1 and Volume 2, and they just cover, if you're not familiar with her poetry, they cover a really nice range of her work. Um, and, like I said, very New Englandy, very Cape and Islands, that sort of scenery and experience, which I think is really lovely. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to some art notes, because I was thinking about all the stuff I wanted to tell you in this very last class while you're drawing. And turned out to be quite a lot. All right. So here we go. Lots to read while you guys are drawing along. Notes for the final, another summer of drawing class. So one of the things I thought about was how students of art often want classes and tutoring in order to improve their drawing, which is, what most of us do. And often, often what we're after, and I'm including myself absolutely in this, is that we're after a way for our paintings or drawings to look great every single time. We're given that impression by what we see in museums and even what we see online, that there's sort of, once you get to a particular point of expertise or practice, or once you know certain techniques, every single drawing you're going to do is going to work. But, as we've seen from early examples that I've tried to show you through these classes, every artist, even those ones whose names are very familiar, throughout the world, had sketches that were half finished or that went nowhere. Some were just sort of jottings that they put down, and others, let's be honest, really weren't all that great, which is good news. Good news for all the rest of us. So those sketches are not imbued with greatness just because so and so drew them. Rather, they have achieved a certain amount of value through their scarcity, and because they broaden our understanding of how an artist actually works. And I think that's really so important, to be able to see that this artist or that artist was, just sort of sketching people at the market, and maybe their figurative work wasn't really all that great in the moment, but later on they were able to take that observation and turn it into, something amazing. Just this accumulation of images in our head that we've been talking about. It's so important. But I think what happens is we tend to see, we come across those sketches now, and people are oohing and ahhing about them as if they have some sort of major greatness in and of themselves, whereas really they were some of the tools that artists used. And because they drew and sketched so much, they achieved the facility to do the great work. So I think it's important to look at preparatory sketches and all of that sort of jottings and doodlings and such that artists do as being part and parcel of what we do. We're on the same course that they were on. They got where they were getting because they kept doing it. So those artists' works aren't in museums and private collections due to some sort of mystery that can be imparted in an art class. They got there because they just kept doing it. They kept drawing, and some of those works achieved a certain level of greatness. So all of you, everyone, either attending live in this class or watching the video later, you have all benefited and improved tremendously by attending and watching these classes and doing these drawings. Not because I am some sort of, I've got some sort of secret that I was able to impart, just because you kept doing it. Particularly those folks who have gone through all the videos or attended all the classes or even most of them. I mean, real life gets in the way, doesn't it? It's very difficult. You've seen me not be able to be in my studio every week to do the classes and have to sort of make it up. So, and that's because I knew all of you guys were waiting for me. It's difficult. It's difficult in life to be able to do something consistently, and to have done it as often as you now have is fantastic. I know you've all improved. Some of you have been sending drawings to me over the course of the last couple of years, and I've seen tremendous progress. And even from those of you who are not doing that, which is certainly not a requirement, I know that you wouldn't be here trying if you weren't seeing something happen and if you weren't enjoying it. So, when it comes to this idea of how much time we have to put into drawing and how much, that we always sort of think that there's this ultimate time or place or way of living that's going to give you this time to spend on art. And it'll all be magical and all your drawings will come out beautifully and you'll be in touch with the muses and all of that. And I've seen people, build studios and buy expensive stuff and this, that, and the other, and still not have that time and still feel as if something's missing. And I'd like to, encourage you not to worry about that. That there is never that cordon bleu moment. Instead, what we have is stew, right? We have the stew of our lives. And one of those vegetables is art and is drawing. And, what we can hope is we can hope that the stew has more of that vegetable in. And, we can throw a little more in there. We can balance it in that general direction. But, it's always going to be we're not people living in ivory towers. Our lives are always going to be full of all sorts of things. And what's important is that we just keep doing it, that we just keep doing, we just keep adding that vegetable to the stew, because that is what makes the difference. So that's the secret. That's the secret to drawing well, is drawing. That is the secret. That's what nobody wants to hear. But, as I started off these classes saying, observation and practice are the keys to mastery. And you have been doing it. That's not something you now have to do in the future or remember for the future. You're living it. You're already doing that. You're already throwing those vegetables into the stew, and you're doing great. So masters become masters in part because they drew and painted a lot, or current masters draw and paint a lot. Some maybe a great deal of that work, wasn't all that great. Some of it was just okay, but because they did so much of it, the pieces that were really good rose to the top. Others just, developed a certain ability to, the work started coming out better and better and more of it. But it doesn't mean that every single thing worked. It means that the pieces that we see in public work, we don't see the ones that were cut up and thrown away. We don't see the ones that were burned, and so an artist does control their output and some of the, some of the illusion, because part of the illusion, I think, for a working artist is to try to make it look like it always works and that everything always comes out beautifully and that you just toss off something that you actually took 15 hours to do. And it's a little unfortunate, but, I think that has been part of the art world and the art business for centuries. So, but due to the degree of effort these artists, these masters have put in, a good number of their pieces have had that special something that is part of the realm of great art. So even artists who, for many reasons, did not produce a large volume of work, someone like Vermeer, for example, still committed themselves in a dedicated way to the work they did have the time to produce. And that gave them a far more advanced trajectory than someone who didn't try, who just basically goofed about, never applied themselves or thought through their drawing as to how to solve problems. Because sometimes you actually have to fight your way through a drawing or painting. And often those paintings that you do end up sort of fighting your way through, maybe they don't really have that spark, but you learned something anyway. Or maybe they came out in the end because you did work really hard, having achieved a level of technical ability or design or finish or something that you hadn't achieved before. So it's just worth it. It's really, art doesn't have to be a fight all the time, but sometimes it is. and it's really just more a matter of going, okay, I've thought as much as I feel like I can manage today on this particular drawing or painting. I'm either going to put it aside and work on something else, or I'm just going to walk away and do something not related to drawing or painting. When I come back to it, the problems will not seem as large, and I'll have figured out a way to solve it, and I'll keep moving forward. And in that way, we continue to teach ourselves. And that is the most important thing. There will always be something new to learn in art. Every drawing you undertake, no matter how quickly you did it, whether it's like a sketch at a train station or a piece that you work on for weeks, it will teach you something new. You can learn even without a physical teacher, even if you just pay attention to what your experience and eyes tell you. Is that perspective what you wanted? If it isn't, change it. Does that foot on that person look right? And if it doesn't, maybe sometime drawing feet in different poses is in order. You can, it's great to have someone like me sort of coaching you along. At the same time, you sort of see now how I go about teaching, and you can teach yourself to a great extent in that exact same manner. Because that's what I sort of did, not having taken a lot of formal classes at all, having to just draw and then figure out why something was or wasn't working, and then how to repeat or not repeat that in the future. I think that's just part of how we go about growing as an artist. At some point, we do have to take that role of teaching ourselves on. And it's wonderful to take classes from a myriad number of different teachers if you want to. It's also okay not to do that at all. It's completely up to you. Some people enjoy that sort of social feeling. Other people are happy, kind of like I am, just to sort of doggedly march on. Whatever's comfortable for you is fine. So as you work on these, as you sometimes fight your way through a drawing, and some of them work out, some of them don't. The ones that don't work out so well, every drawing or painting that does not have to be reworked or corrected to perfection. Like, you don't have to just keep beating your head against that wall in any way whatsoever. It's perfectly fine to get to the point and go, you know what? This isn't bad. Yeah, probably didn't do that part all that well. I'm going to move on and try something else. I think we sort of grow up with this myth of the arduous nature of being an artist. An artist should be starving. They should be living in a garret at the top of a building where it's cold and damp and miserable. They shouldn't have enough money for art supplies. They should die a young and ignominious death of some sort. I mean, what the heck? It can't be like that, right? I mean, that's not how life is. It doesn't have to be like that. And likewise, when it comes to drawing, we can be drawing for enjoyment and for the pleasure of it. We have to, we have to be able to find that within ourselves, and to be able to walk away. There's no art police looking over your shoulder telling that, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that, you haven't finished it yet. It just, if you've got that little guy on your shoulder, telling you all that stuff, just flick him off, tell him to go away. um, so often attempts to make something perfect result in disaster. And I'm speaking from experience. But self-critique, either during the process or after the drawing is done, it helps you improve as you go, or it sets you up for improvement for the next piece. So I think it's always good. You're having that conversation with yourself as you're drawing through. You're just sort of, you're keeping on, you're going, hey, is this working? Is it not? I think I'm going to erase something. Oops, I shouldn't have erased that. That was actually better than what I'm drawing now. Okay, lesson learned. You keep moving on, right? There is unlikely to be a time ever when everything you produce is great. It it just doesn't happen that way. And when we look back at people who we consider masters from the past, it looks as if everything they produced was great. But what has happened is that everything that has survived basically has risen to that level of greatness, because along the way, the sketches and the paintings they did that weren't so fabulous or whatever, they just weren't kept through hundreds and hundreds of years. So it gives us a false sense of what an artist does, what they do in their life to get to those really good pieces. But what happens is that the more you draw and observe, the more you learn about what you enjoy, how you like to interpret the world around you, what works for you. How many trees in the drawing is completely up to you today. somebody else's number of trees and yours have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And I think that's just so important to develop that confidence in yourself that your decisions, the decisions you're making about your drawing are right. They're right for you. So the frequency with which you draw and sketch will inevitably lead to some, if not many, of your drawings being very pleasing to you, ones that you want to keep, ones that when you go back and look at them later, even if you've improved over time, you'll be like, wow, that was a really good drawing. And that's the goal, to make art that you like, draw subjects that interest you, not what you should draw. Um, not the first thing that you see necessarily. Take a couple of minutes, to go out in nature or wherever, or even in your home, wherever you are, and look around. Don't go, okay, here's my coffee cup, I'm just going to draw that. It could be that there's some interesting arrangement of the bowls and things on your countertop, or the books on your coffee table, or whatever. Even if you're not leaving home, there could be something that you see or even can arrange for yourself that's pleasing to you. Make art that you like. So when you take a few minutes, you look around, your eyes will alight on some scene or object or combination of objects or a person that makes you want to draw. And you're sort of tuning in for that thing that goes, oh, that's kind of nice, And every time you see it, of course, you won't be able to drop everything and draw, but you want to be tuned in for that feeling. That's the feeling that tells you, hey, that's a good composition, or that's going to be kind of interesting because of the contrast, or that's interesting because of the variety of shapes or the variety of colors, or whatever it is that interests you. And then, as often as you possibly can, just draw. A quick sketch or a thumbnail or an hour drawing or a 4-hour drawing, it doesn't matter. Build your own concepts. You'll get better as this as you go. Move objects and edit, remove, or add what you want. There's no need to be a camera. So another person has asked about the foliage, about the leaves. The leaves stress everybody out. If you're feeling stressed about the leaves, I just want you to know so is everyone else. It's really important when you're looking at a scene like this and we can't actually see the leaves, to not think of them as leaves, and instead to think of them as sort of like these ephemeral kind of loose masses of a shape of a particular value. So it is very difficult to figure out what to do, and it would be my inclination to use a pencil with a beveled end, which isn't very distinct, to sort of make shapes that don't look like leaves, but look like the kind of an airy accumulation of something sort of fuzzy going on top of the more defined branches. And that doesn't sound very descriptive, but it is essentially the way that I would draw, is by sort of, when I talk about feeling your way through a drawing, trying to figure out, if you've got a kind of a fuzzy, indistinct area, then you want to draw it in a fuzzy, indistinct manner, and not to add in the stuff we know. So what we know is we know those are little tiny leaves emerging, and we know there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And it is our brain wants us to draw those. It says that's what's there, little hundreds of leaves, draw those. And that is completely not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is show a scene, a swampland scene with these wonderful trees, and the foliage. Those are bit players. You can even leave them completely out. You could draw no foliage whatsoever and just draw a bunch of the tree trunks, more like you see over on the left-hand side or the far right-hand side, and leave it at that. So it would be my idea for anyone who's running into trouble with the foliage, try just doing a little bit of, very like mid-tone, like, 30%, 40% perhaps, shading or blending, or using a beveled pencil end, something that is not sharp and distinct, that doesn't get you to start wanting to draw leaves, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And what you're looking for is that feeling of just sort of the little bit of a coating of green that starts to appear here and there on top of these, kind of the way these trees grow. The smaller twigs go upwards, and so as these leaves come out, it looks almost as if the green is sort of floating on top of the other branches. And that's all you're looking for, is just an indistinct shape. But if it's driving you nuts and you're starting to focus overly on it, I would not worry. I would just leave whatever you've got for leaves is sure to be fine, and worry instead about the darks that you see and the mid ground trees, the reflections, and all of that. As those things become more distinct, whatever you have done for the foliage will read as foliage, because really all we're doing is we're drawing shapes and values that symbolize something we know exists there. So we're not trying to draw little leaves. We're trying to draw sort of this airy mass that we as humans know would be emerging leaves. Now, it's not going to happen in 2 seconds. You're going to try, you're going to try something and it may or may not work. And then the next time you sit down to draw a scene like this, you might, try something a little bit different. And after a while, you'll end up with some go-to ways that you sort of approach this kind of thing. I tend to now, because of these classes, go to those pencils that I have put the beveled edge on with a little bit of sandpaper, because I can get the wider smoothness to sort of create a large area. And that gets me away from my inclination, because my personal inclination is to go for detail. My personal inclination is to start drawing every little twig that you see in there, because it's just, I'm sure some of you are like that too. We have a tendency to focus that way. So I hope for everyone who's thinking about that. Likewise, that goes for the twigs. If you squint and look at this scene, a lot of that twig stuff disappears as well. It disappears into that same kind of mid-tone. So really, we only have to draw the darkest branches and the darkest of the twigs, and our brain will sort of fill it all in. So hopefully that's kind of useful, and different people, they approach it different ways. Years ago, I drew for a t-shirt design, I drew a profile view for a boat builder, of his boat. And I didn't join up all the lines because they didn't need to be joined up, not the ones around the edge so much, but the interior ones that showed, a little bit of shape or curve or this, that, and the other. And this guy wanted every line joined up. He wanted the whole thing joined up because he's looking at it as an, kind of a boat architect would, where things do not just disappear off into distance. And so once I joined them all the lines up, he was really happy. So, I just have my one viewpoint on this. You have seen, and I know you have, wonderful pieces of work where every little thing is detailed, and it's gorgeous for that. So, this is definitely an individual take. But I did want to talk for a minute, and this is sort of, a little bit on the same subject actually, but not really so much about this kind of situation, but more about the idea of, where do we have to draw the line on the detail? When we look at a photograph that a camera has taken a picture of, where does that have to stop? So I'd like you to think about this as you're drawing. The world is constantly in motion. Our eyes move all the time, and everything moves all the time. Even if we try to sit perfectly still, with our eyes not moving in a closed room, dust motes still dance, the blood in our veins still pumps, we breathe, our cells are born in decay, atoms and neutrons and protons move constantly, and time itself moves constantly. And yet we have this idea that a drawing or painting should capture just one instant, as a camera does, and somehow freeze it for posterity. That is not how we see or experience the world. The sun moves, the clouds move, the earth and everything in it is in motion. Even stones erode and the earth's plates shift. So a camera can freeze an instant, and the dust motes can hang in the air. It's a useful tool, and I love photography for everything it does, but a camera can't do what you can do. No matter your level of drawing ability, it cannot create anything unique and different, full of life and energy, full of the world the way you see it. Many artists start off, and I was amongst them, wanting to freeze everything in time. After some experience, we learned that in whatever we are observing, some parts stay more still than others. That requires us to practice drawing and painting in ways that explore movement as well as strong design, convincing form, and the story we're trying to tell. So I share this so that you don't fret if every line you draw isn't just so. The world is already a different one than it was when I started talking. The planet has spun a little further, the earth has moved, the air has moved, and time has moved. So let your lines fall where they may. Keep the ones that please you and remove the ones that don't. Draw on your experience from life and draw often and always. You will see more of this world and live more and experience more, just as artists and writers and poets and musicians have done since the dawn of time. And if that isn't a good reason to always be sketching, I don't know what is. And lastly, do what you can to encourage others to draw, regardless of age or ability. You know yourself how drawing can soothe the mind for a time and create a shared experience and take you away from the ups and downs of life. Now that you know this, look out for opportunities to get a friend or a child or a family member sketching. Even if you just draw together once, you will be doing a great good, perhaps over coffee or a walk somewhere. So, I want to sort of, we're getting near the end of our drawing time, and I do have some notes to wrap up with, like I normally do. But I wanted to tell you something that I think is really important. It's been my distinct pleasure to teach this series of drawing classes. What started out as a response to having to go online with a talk on portraiture for the Vineyard Haven Public Library when the pandemic started, and yay to the Vineyard Haven Public Library. Well done. Thank you so much. But this whole series has blossomed into an art community of its own, which I'll treasure always. And those of you watching on the video whenever you can, days or months from now, are also part of this community. So please stay in touch. I'm happy at any time, years from now, to hear from you. But I think, we tend to, when a class like this sort of, ends, we feel like, oh no, we're just going to be by ourselves, that we won't have this thing to join us up every week. And I want to just share this with you. If you want to feel connected again to this experience that we've had, all you have to do is get your pencil out and draw. And I and everyone attending these classes will always be with you, encouraging you on. Because if you think about it, no matter how good or experienced the artist is, we're all working by ourselves. So every time you pick up the pencil and you start drawing, you're immediately tapping into that network of artists around the world, not just painters and people drawing with pencil and charcoal, but also people making pottery, knitting and crafting, woodworking, all of that sort of thing. There's a hum of creativity going on all the time. And all we need to do to be part of that, larger art community, is to just participate by drawing. You can see I'm trying every different way I can possibly think of to get you guys to draw. So let's go ahead and wrap up this. I'm sure wherever your sketch is now, you're like, okay, I've done enough bald cypress trees. So let's move on to the end here. Oops. Okay, so we're wrapping up the last class here. You know that I started doing this last year. I think I kept using the catchphrase "draw on" as a way to encourage you to take action and draw, kind of like rock on, only but for drawing. But I actually looked this up the other day, and the official meaning also applies. So if you look up "draw on" in the dictionary, it says to use one's experience, talents, or skills as a resource. And isn't that exactly what I've been talking about with concepts? You don't need to have a concept to draw, but if there's a theme or an idea you want to use for a drawing, look to your own life and experience and stories as the first place to find ways to bring that concept to life. It's usually, I hate to use the word more authentic, but it is actually more authentic than, sometimes we want to relate to somebody maybe in another part of the world and an experience they're going through. And it's not always easy to tap into that because we're really not living their life. But we can often find parallel stories in our own life to illustrate that particular scenario that they're going through. So it's just something to think about there. Objects and scenes can symbolize larger issues or stories. There are some wonderful books out there, and if your library doesn't have them, you can certainly ask them to order them. On traditional use of symbols in art, for example, where you can, things, for example, the hourglass, the watch, soap bubbles even, all symbolize the passage of time. And it can be fun to throw some of those traditional symbols into your modern artwork. Draw first for yourself and for your own expression and enjoyment. It's really difficult. And particularly, I think the more public exposure you start to get once you start showing and that kind of thing. People like certain types of things you do. And it can be difficult to veer off that path and sort of break away and try new things. You might think that, oh gosh, if I became a professional artist, I'd have more freedom. And in some cases, that isn't actually the case. And you have to figure out ways to inject that freedom into your work. And that's just something to keep in mind as you get better and better. So if your intention is clear to you, whatever it is that you're drawing, there's a good chance it'll be clear to many others. Don't worry from the start whether what you're doing will be universally understood. It's likely not to be. There's always going to be someone who doesn't get what you're actually doing. So just as long as you understand it, go for it. And when in doubt, a good title for your artwork can sometimes help things along and give your audience a bit of clarity. So technique, this is really the same type of information I've been ending with for the last few classes because you guys know this. You can now mix and match all kinds of drawing techniques, line work, lively line work, directional lines, different types of pencil leads, different types of ways of sharpening your pencils. We ended up concentrating a lot on graphite for this series of classes, which, I hadn't really had a particular intention along those lines when we started, but it turned out to be such a wonderful tool. And we added a little charcoal in, but we kind of stuck to this. But what we were able to do with pencils was really quite amazing. But don't be bashful about using the eraser or lots of different types of erasers. The eraser as a tool is perfectly valid, not just for erasing lines that you didn't like. Let the white of the white paper do its thing. No need to fill the whole page in with marks. Tone paper, let the midtones do most of the work and only worry about the darks and the highlights. So, this is, I think at this point, I've probably beaten all of this into your head. So let's move on. One more little bit of info. So now that you have now that you really have a lot more confidence, particularly with graphite, I think it's time for you on your own time to branch out when you feel like it into some of these other drawing media, because you're really going to do the same sort of thing. Whether it's pen and ink, Conte crayons, silver point, more charcoal, you'll learn their characteristics, what the different tools do, how to apply them, what works for, atmosphere, what works for detail, what works for broad swatches of, swaths of color, and look at the work of other artists, past and present, because I bet now when you go back and look at some of these artists, you'll be able to tell how they did it. Some of your strokes will look just like their strokes. And so you can, if you see a technique that looks interesting, just give it a try. There's no reason not to. And when you start drawing, I think it's really important to take a breath and engage your mind so that you're thinking your way through the drawing. You'll make better decisions and your path forward will be clearer. In other words, you'll have more fun. I'm just like every other artist. I often sit down and the pencil starts moving, and that's fine. But at some point you have to go, okay, let's start thinking a little bit about what we're doing here, and that's when you really start to engage and get in the flow. So it's worth doing that, not being disassociated from your drawing. So just remember, wherever you are in the world, whenever you're watching this, we are all with you. Just get that pencil in motion and draw on. All right, everyone. It has been wonderful seeing you for another summer of drawing.